The chamber was silent, except for the quiet hum of technology that kept thousands of beings alive in the void of space. Daniel Hayes stood alone in the center of the room, surrounded by barriers that shimmered with blue light. Above him, the judges sat in their elevated seats, looking down at the human who had broken their laws. Senior adjudicator Velthan was a creature that Daniel had never seen before his arrest. The insectoid being stood nearly 8 feet tall, with 4 arms and eyes that looked like cut crystal. When Velthan spoke, his voice echoed through the chamber like the sound of breaking glass. "Lieutenant Daniel Hayes, you have been found guilty of violating the Galactic Commerce Treaty," Velthan said. His mandibles clicked together between words. "You transported unauthorized medical supplies to Colony Refuge 12, a settlement under strict quarantine protocols. Do you understand these charges?" Daniel nodded. His throat was dry, but he would not show weakness. Not here, not now. "The colony was dying," Daniel said quietly. 47 children were sick. They needed help. Velthan's crystalline eyes reflected no emotion. "The quarantine existed for the safety of all galactic citizens. Your actions put countless lives at risk." Daniel wanted to argue. He wanted to tell them that the quarantine was wrong, that it was built on lies and greed. But his defender had already tried that. Pixra, the small rabbit-like Quellan assigned to represent him, had presented evidence showing the quarantine was unnecessary. She had shown medical records proving that Festin fever was not as dangerous as the authorities claimed. She had even brought forward testimony from doctors who said the disease had been misdiagnosed from the start. The tribunal had dismissed it all without proper consideration. Daniel looked around the chamber. Hundreds of beings from dozens of worlds watched him. Some looked curious, others looked bored, a few looked sympathetic, but they were silent. No one would speak for a human who had broken the law, even if the law itself was corrupt. In one corner of the chamber, Daniel spotted Councilman Zeph Torin. The human politician sat with the other council members, his face carefully blank. Torin had already made his position clear during the public statements before the trial. He had called Daniel a criminal who embarrassed all of humanity. He had demanded harsh punishment to prove that humans respected galactic law. Daniel felt disgust rise in his chest. Torin was willing to sacrifice one of his own people just to gain favor with the powerful alien corporations that controlled so much of galactic commerce. "The medical supplies you transported were unauthorized," Velthan continued. "They had not been approved by the Pharmax Collective, the official medical authority for that sector. Your actions undermined their authority and violated trade agreements." "The Pharmax Collective wanted the colony to buy their expensive treatments," Daniel said. His voice was stronger now. "Treatments that cost 50 times more than the simple vaccines I delivered. They were letting children die to make a profit." Murmurs spread through the chamber. Some beings shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But Velthan raised one of his 4 hands, and silence fell again. "Your opinions on corporate practices are not relevant to these proceedings," the adjudicator said coldly. "You violated the law. The tribunal must now determine your sentence." Daniel felt his heart beat faster. He had known this moment was coming. From the start of the trial, it had been clear that the verdict was already decided. The trial was just a performance, a way to make his punishment look fair and legal. Velthan consulted with the other judges in a language Daniel did not understand. Their conversation lasted several minutes. Finally, the senior adjudicator turned back to face the chamber. "The tribunal has reached a decision," Velthan announced. "Lieutenant Daniel Hayes, you are hereby sentenced to exile on the planet designated Carvos 9. The chamber erupted in noise. Some beings gasped. Others began talking urgently to their neighbors. Daniel stood very still, processing what he had just heard. Carvos 9. He had heard of it. Every pilot had heard of it. The planet was infamous throughout the galaxy as a place of death. It was used as a dumping ground for the worst criminals, a place where no execution was needed because the planet itself killed everyone sent there. "This sentence demonstrates the mercy of this tribunal," Velthon said, speaking over the noise. "We do not take your life directly. Instead, you will have the opportunity to survive if you possess the strength and will to do so. However, you should know that no being has ever survived more than 3 planetary rotations on Carvos 9. Mercy. Daniel almost laughed at the word. They were going to kill him slowly instead of quickly, and they called it mercy. Pixra stood up, her long ears trembling. "Senior Adjudicator, I must protest. This sentence is excessive. My client saved lives. He should not—" "Your protest is noted and dismissed," Velthon interrupted. "The sentence stands. Lieutenant Hayes will be transported to Carvos 9 within 3 standard days." Daniel felt the eyes of the entire chamber on him. They wanted to see him break. They wanted to see fear or anger or desperation. Instead, he looked directly at Velthon and spoke clearly. "I saved 47 children," Daniel said. "They were going to die because your precious Pharmax collective cared more about profit than lives. I gave them medicine that cost almost nothing and cured them in days. I would do it again." The chamber went quiet again. Even Velthon seemed surprised by Daniel's calm defiance. "If you want to kill me for that, then kill me," Daniel continued, "but have the courage to do it honestly. Do not hide behind words like mercy and exile. You are sentencing me to death on a planet that will tear me apart, and you are doing it because I exposed the corruption in your system. At least be honest about it." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Velthon's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of anger in his species. "Remove the prisoner," the adjudicator ordered. Guards moved forward, beings in armor that Daniel could not identify. They released the barrier around him and took hold of his arms. Daniel did not resist. There was no point. As they led him toward the exit, he looked one more time at the judges who had condemned him. He had told them the truth. He had saved those children. And he would accept whatever came next because of it. If death was the price for doing what was right, then he would pay it without regret. The guards escorted him through long corridors to a transport ship. Other prisoners were already on board, locked in their cells. Daniel was placed in a small room with a single window. As the ship detached from the station and began its journey toward Carvos 9, Daniel sat on the hard bench and closed his eyes. He thought about the children he had saved. He remembered their faces when he had delivered the medicine. He remembered their parents crying with relief and gratitude. He remembered the little girl who had given him a drawing of a spaceship, telling him he was a hero. Whatever happened on Carvos 9, those memories would go with him. Those 47 live. The survival pod hit the surface of Carvos 9 with enough force to rattle Daniel's bones. Restraints dug into his chest and shoulders as the small craft bounced twice before sliding to a stop. Red warning lights flashed inside the cramped space, and a mechanical voice announced his arrival in a language he barely understood. Daniel released the restraints with shaking hands. The pod's door hissed open, and immediately he felt the difference. The air that rushed in burned his throat and nose. It smelled like sulfur and rot, thick and heavy in his lungs. He stepped out onto the rocky ground and nearly fell. The gravity was crushing. Every movement felt like he was carrying twice his own weight on his back. His knees buckled, and he caught himself against the side of the pod, breathing hard. This was Carvos 9. This was the planet that killed everyone sent here. Daniel forced himself to stand upright and look around. The landscape was harsh and alien. Sharp black rocks jutted up from red sand. In the distance, he could see mountains with peaks that glowed orange, probably volcanoes. The sky was a sick yellow color, and the sun looked too large and too bright. The temperature was already making him sweat, and he had only been outside for a minute. Daniel turned back to the pod. Inside, there were 3 days of rations, a water recycler, and an emergency beacon. The beacon would only activate if he survived 30 days. He grabbed the supplies and the small toolkit that came with them. Everything felt heavier than it should in the crushing gravity. As he loaded the supplies into a pack, Daniel noticed something in the distance. Other pods. Or what was left of them. Rusted metal frames half buried in the sand, torn apart by wind and time. Evidence of all the others who had been sent here to die. Daniel felt a cold determination settle in his chest. He would not end up like them. He refused to give Velthan and the Tribunal the satisfaction of his death. The first priority was shelter. The temperature was rising as the sun climbed higher. Daniel remembered his survival training from his military days. In hostile environments, shelter came before food, before water, before everything else. He needed to get out of the open. He spotted a ridge of rocks about half a mile away. Every step toward it was torture. The gravity made his legs burn with effort, sweat poured down his face, and the hot air dried it almost instantly. By the time he reached the ridge, Daniel was gasping for breath and his vision was blurry. But he had found what he needed. There was a crack in the rocks, a narrow opening that led into a cave system. Daniel squeezed through the gap and found himself in a larger chamber. The temperature inside was cooler and the air was slightly less toxic. Daniel collapsed against the wall and let himself rest. His body screamed in protest. Muscles that had never worked this hard were already cramping. His lungs felt raw from breathing the acidic air. But he was alive. For now. He spent the rest of that first day exploring the cave. It went deeper than he expected, with multiple chambers connected by narrow passages. Water dripped from the ceiling in some places, and Daniel tasted it carefully. It was bitter but not immediately deadly. The volcanic rock was filtering it somehow, making it safer than the water on the surface. That first night, Daniel learned about the storms. The wind began to howl as the sun set, and within an hour, it sounded like the planet itself was screaming. Rain fell, but it was not normal rain. When drops hit the rocks outside the cave, they sizzled and smoked, acid rain that could strip flesh from bone. Daniel went deeper into the cave system and waited for the storm to pass. It lasted 6 hours. When morning came, the landscape outside looked different. The acid rain had dissolved some of the sand, revealing more of the buried pods from previous exiles. Days turned into weeks. Daniel fell into a routine that kept him alive. He woke at dawn and exercised, forcing his body to adapt to the heavy gravity. Push-ups were agony. Running in place made his heart feel like it would explode. But every day it got a little easier. His muscles grew stronger, denser, more capable of handling the strain. Food was a challenge. The rations from the pod ran out after 3 days, just as promised. Daniel had to find alternatives. There were plants on Carvos 9, tough, leathery things that grew between the rocks. Most were poisonous. Daniel tested them carefully, eating tiny amounts and waiting to see if he got sick. He found 2 species that he could eat in small quantities without dying. They tasted terrible, but they kept him alive. Water came from the caves. Daniel mapped the underground system, finding pools and streams that ran through the volcanic rock. He built a better filter using materials from the survival pod, cloth, and charcoal and sand layered together. The water still tasted bad, but it was safer. The real danger came from the wildlife. Carvos 9 was not empty. Creatures lived here, things that had evolved to survive the impossible conditions. Daniel encountered his first predator on day 12. It was 6-legged with armor plating covering its body. Venomous spines ran along its back, and its mouth had too many teeth. The creature was perfectly built for this world, fast and deadly despite the heavy gravity. Daniel had been gathering plants near the cave entrance when the predator attacked. It came from behind a rock, moving faster than Daniel expected. He threw himself to the side, barely avoiding the snapping jaws. The creature's spines scraped against his arm, and immediately Daniel felt fire spread through his veins. The venom was not instantly fatal, but it was strong. Daniel's vision blurred, and his arm went numb. The predator circled him, ready to attack again. Daniel's mind raced. He could not outrun this thing. He could barely move with the venom spreading through his system, but he was standing near the ridge where the rocks were unstable. When the predator lunged again, Daniel rolled toward the cliff edge. The creature followed, and Daniel kicked out with both legs, hitting the rocks beneath the predator. The stone crumbled, and the creature fell, sliding down the slope in a small avalanche. Daniel crawled back to the cave, his arm throbbing with pain. He spent the next 2 days fighting off the effects of the venom, fever burning through his body while he shivered in the cool cave. But he survived. His body fought off the poison, and slowly the feeling returned to his arm. After that, Daniel was more careful. He learned to watch for the predators, to recognize their tracks in the sand. He created weapons from salvaged metal and sharp stone. He set up warning systems around his cave using bits of wire that would make noise if disturbed. The isolation was harder to fight than the physical dangers. Daniel talked to himself to keep his mind active. He talked to the Tribunal, imagining what he would say when he saw them again. He talked to the children he had saved, telling them about his day, about the strange things he saw. On day 28, during an exploration of the deeper caves, Daniel found something that changed everything. Ancient ruins. Walls carved with symbols he did not recognize. Technology that had long since stopped working. And in a sealed chamber, protected from the elements, he found data crystals. Daniel carefully extracted the crystals and brought them back to his shelter. He used his salvaged data pad, powered by a solar array he had built from pod components, to examine the crystals. The language was unknown, but there were mathematical notations and star charts that were universal. These ruins proved that intelligent life had once existed on Carvos 9. The planet had not always been a death world. Something had happened here. Some disaster that had transformed this place into a hell. Daniel spent his free time studying the crystals, documenting everything. He did not fully understand what he was reading, but he recognized references to diseases, to biological weapons, to a civilization destroying itself. On day 32, Daniel activated the emergency beacon. He did not expect rescue. The Tribunal probably assumed he was dead, but if there was any chance, he needed to signal that he was alive. Weeks passed, then months. Daniel's body continued to adapt. His bone density increased to handle the gravity. His lungs learned to process the toxic air more efficiently. Scars covered his arms and legs from various encounters with the local wildlife. His hair grew long, and his face became weathered from the harsh sun. But Daniel Hayes was alive. Against all odds, against every prediction, he had survived the unsurvivable. He had turned Carvos 9 from a death sentence into his home. On day 174, Daniel was outside his cave when he saw something. Captain Lisa Morgan had been a survey officer for 12 years. She had seen strange things in space, unexplainable phenomena and alien life forms that defied logic. But nothing had prepared her for the sight of Daniel Hayes standing in front of her, alive and relatively healthy after 6 months on Carvos 9. "You need to come with us," she said, still unable to fully process what she was seeing. "We need to get you medical attention." Daniel nodded. He walked toward the ship with steady steps, moving easily despite the crushing gravity that was making Morgan's crew struggle even in their protective suits. When they reached the ship, Daniel paused at the entrance. "I need to bring something," he said, showing them the data crystals. "I found evidence, important evidence." Morgan looked at her medical officer, Dr. Ben Parker, who was staring at Daniel like he was seeing a ghost. Parker snapped out of it and gestured for Daniel to board. Inside the ship, they removed their protective gear. Daniel breathed in the filtered air and felt his lungs relax. The ship's gravity was standard, and after months at double strength, Daniel felt almost weightless. "We need to scan you," Parker said, pulling out his medical equipment. "I need to understand how you survived." Daniel sat patiently while Parker ran scan after scan. The doctor's expression grew more confused with each result. "Your bone density has increased by 40%, Parker said, looking at his readings. "Your muscle mass has increased despite obvious signs of inadequate nutrition. Your cardiovascular system is operating at peak efficiency. You have partial resistance to toxins that should have killed you weeks ago." "I adapted," Daniel said simply. "Humans do not adapt this fast," Parker argued. "This level of physiological change should take generations, not months." "Humans adapt when we have to," Daniel replied. "We evolved on a planet that tried to kill us too. Earth might not be as extreme as Carvos 9, but it taught us how to survive." Security Chief Kate Sullivan, a woman with sharp eyes and a military bearing, leaned forward. "What did you find in those caves?" Daniel explained about the ruins, the ancient civilization, and the data crystals. He showed them his documentation, months of careful notes and observations. The crew listened in growing amazement as Daniel described his survival techniques and the discoveries he had made. "This changes everything," Morgan said quietly. "The Tribunal sent you there to die, but you survived and you found proof that intelligent life existed there." "This is going to cause problems." "Good," Daniel said. "They deserve problems." Morgan made the decision quickly. She declared Daniel under her protective custody and set course for Meridian 7. Before they left Carvos 9's orbit, she sent encrypted messages to people she trusted in Galactic Command. One message went to Admiral Helen Cross, a decorated human officer known for her integrity and refusal to be bought. The message was simple. Daniel Hayes is alive, and he has evidence of corruption. The journey to Meridian 7 took 5 days. During that time, Daniel recovered his strength. He told his story to the crew, who listened with a mixture of horror and admiration. Sullivan, who had served in the military before joining survey work, recognized the mental discipline it took to survive what Daniel had endured. "You never gave up," she said one evening as they sat in the ship's common area. "Most people would have laid down and died within a week." "Giving up would mean they won," Daniel replied. "I refuse to give them that satisfaction." News of Daniel's survival leaked before they reached the station. Morgan suspected someone in Galactic Command had spread the word, possibly to prepare for what was coming. By the time the Wandering Star docked at Meridian 7, the station was in chaos. Media representatives from dozens of worlds crowded the docking areas. Security had to clear a path for Daniel and the crew to disembark. Cameras flashed and recorded, and voices shouted questions that Daniel could not hear over the noise. Human advocacy groups were already organizing protests, demanding Daniel's immediate release and an investigation into the Tribunal. The Pharmax Collective issued statements claiming Daniel must have received outside help to survive, that no one could live on Carvos 9 without advanced technology. The Galactic Tribunal had no choice but to reconvene. The media attention made it impossible to ignore Daniel's return. Velthan, the senior adjudicator who had sentenced Daniel, called for an emergency session. Daniel was brought to the same chamber where he had been convicted, but this time everything was different. He was not standing alone as a condemned criminal. Captain Morgan stood beside him, along with Admiral Cross, who had arrived to serve as his advocate. The chamber was packed with observers, and cameras recorded everything. Velthan looked down at Daniel with his crystalline eyes. And Daniel thought he saw something like anger in that alien face. "Lieutenant Hayes," the adjudicator began, his voice echoing through the chamber, "you were sentenced to exile on Carvos 9, yet you stand before us alive. Explain how this is possible. Daniel stepped forward. His voice was calm and clear. I survived because humans are survivors, he said. We come from a world that taught us to adapt or die. Carvos 9 was more extreme than Earth, but the principle was the same. I found shelter, I found water, I found food. I learned to avoid the predators and endure the storms. I did what humans have always done. I refused to give up. Murmurs spread through the chamber. Velthan raised a hand for silence. You claim to have survived without assistance, without advanced technology? I had what came in the survival pod, Daniel said. Basic supplies for 3 days. After that, I used what I found on the planet. I documented everything. Captain Morgan and her crew can verify my condition when they found me. Morgan stepped forward. The medical scans confirm that Lieutenant Hayes is still baseline human. He has no enhancements, no modifications. His body adapted through extreme physical conditioning. Dr. Parker's full report is available for review. Daniel pulled out the data crystals. I also found something else on Carvos 9. These ruins prove that intelligent life once existed on that planet, and the data they left behind contains information about biological weapons, including an early form of Festin fever. The chamber erupted in noise. Adjudicators leaned forward in their seats. Media representatives frantically recorded every word. Daniel continued speaking, his voice cutting through the chaos. Festin fever was not a natural outbreak on Colony Refuge 12. The disease was introduced deliberately. The quarantine was unnecessary, designed to create artificial demand for expensive Pharmax treatments. I saved those children with simple vaccines that cost almost nothing. I was sent to die because I exposed this corruption. Velthan's mandibles clicked rapidly. These are serious accusations. Do you have proof? Admiral Cross stepped forward, holding a data pad. I have proof. Galactic military intelligence has been investigating the Pharmax Collective for months. Financial records show payments from Pharmax to several Tribunal members and politicians. While we cannot prove direct conspiracy in Lieutenant Hayes' case, we can prove a pattern of corruption. She projected the records onto the chamber's main display. Numbers and transactions filled the screen, showing money flowing from Pharmax accounts to the personal holdings of various officials. One name appeared repeatedly, Councilman Zeph Torin. The human politician, sitting in his usual seat among the council members, turned pale. He stood up quickly. This is outrageous, Torin said, his voice shaking. These records are fabricated. This is a human conspiracy to undermine galactic authority. The records are authentic, Admiral Cross said coldly. They have been verified by 3 independent auditing firms. You received payments totaling 6 million credits over the past 2 years. In exchange, you supported policies that benefited Pharmax, including the extended quarantine of Colony Refugee 12. Torin looked around desperately. No one met his eyes. Even the other council members were moving away from him, literally shifting their seats to put distance between themselves and the disgraced politician. Velthan attempted to regain control of the proceedings. This tribunal will review all evidence presented. However, Lieutenant Hayes' survival does not change the fact that he violated quarantine protocols. Protocols based on false premises, Daniel said. If the quarantine was unnecessary, then my actions were justified. You are not qualified to make that determination, Velthan snapped. Neither are you, apparently, Daniel shot back. You took money from Pharmax. How much did you receive to ensure I was convicted? How much did my death sentence cost? The adjudicator's crystalline eyes seemed to flash with anger. You have no proof of such claims. Then open your financial records, Admiral Cross suggested. Allow an independent audit. If you have nothing to hide, you should have no objection. Velthan said nothing. His silence spoke louder than words. Another adjudicator, a human woman named Mira Chen, stood up. She was known for her strict interpretation of law and her refusal to be influenced by politics. I move that this tribunal immediately suspend proceedings pending a full investigation, Chen said. Lieutenant Hayes has presented evidence that calls into question the validity of his original conviction. We can. The investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Once Admiral Cross released the financial records to the public, there was no way to stop the avalanche of revelations that followed. Media outlets across the galaxy picked up the story, and Daniel's survival became the most talked-about event in recent memory. Linguistic experts confirmed that the data crystals from Carvos 9 were authentic. They contained records from a civilization that had destroyed itself through biological warfare. The disease mentioned in the ancient texts was a direct ancestor of Festin fever. The implications were clear. The outbreak on Colony Refuge 12 was not natural. More witnesses came forward. Doctors who had been pressured to support the quarantine. Scientists who had questioned the diagnosis but were silenced. Colonists from Refuge 12 who testified that their pleas for help had been ignored until Daniel arrived with the medicine they needed. The tribunal was forced to hold open hearings. Every session was broadcast across the galaxy, watched by billions of beings. Daniel attended each one, sitting calmly as the evidence mounted against those who had condemned him. On the third day of hearings, Councilman Zeph Torin was called to testify. The human politician arrived surrounded by lawyers, but they could not save him. Admiral Cross presented transaction after transaction, showing how Torin had received payments from Pharmax in exchange for political support. These payments were consulting fees, Torin insisted, sweat visible on his forehead. I provided legitimate advice on policy matters. You provided advice on how to extend a quarantine that was killing children, Admiral Cross said coldly. You knew the outbreak was manageable with basic vaccines, but you supported keeping those vaccines out of the colony because Pharmax paid you to. That is not true, Torin protested. Admiral Cross projected a recording onto the main display. It was a conversation between Torin and a Pharmax executive discussing the quarantine and how to maximize profit from the situation. Torin's own voice filled the chamber, cold and calculating as he discussed the political benefits of appearing tough on quarantine enforcement. Torin's face went white. He tried to speak, but no words came out. His lawyers were already gathering their materials, preparing to distance themselves from their client. You sold out your own people for money and political influence, Admiral Cross said. How many children would have died if Lieutenant Hayes had not acted? Torin stood up shakily and left the chamber without answering. Within hours, he resigned from his position and was arrested pending criminal investigation. His political career was over, but the bigger target was Velthan. The senior adjudicator had presided over hundreds of cases, and now all of them were being reviewed. Questions emerged about other convictions, other sentences that seemed excessive or politically motivated. Daniel was present when investigators finally confronted Velthan directly. It happened during a closed session that was later leaked to the media. The adjudicator sat in his elevated chair, but his authority was gone. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the evidence surrounding him. Your financial records show payments from 17 different corporations over the past 5 years, the lead investigator said. She was a Quellan like Pixara, but older and far more confident. These corporations all had interests in cases you presided over. The correlation is undeniable. Velthan's mandibles clicked slowly. I have committed no crimes. Adjudicators are permitted to have investments and business relationships. Not when those relationships influence your decisions, the investigator countered. We have messages between you and Pharmax executives discussing Lieutenant Hayes' case before the trial even began. You agreed to ensure a harsh sentence in exchange for future considerations. You cannot prove intent, Velthan said. The investigator smiled. We do not need to prove intent. The appearance of corruption is sufficient to remove you from your position. The Galactic Council has already voted. You are hereby relieved of your duties as Senior Adjudicator, effective immediately." Velthon stood up, his forearms trembling. "This is a mistake. I have served the Tribunal for 30 years. "You have served yourself," the investigator said quietly, "and now you will face the consequences." Daniel watched Velthon leave the chamber, escorted by security. The adjudicator did not look at him, but Daniel felt a sense of closure. The being who had sentenced him to death was now facing his own judgment. The hearings continued for 2 more weeks. Each day brought new revelations about the Pharmax Collective and its influence over galactic institutions. Other colonies came forward with stories similar to Refuge 12. Quarantines that lasted too long, treatments that cost too much, alternatives that were suppressed. A pattern emerged. Pharmax had been creating artificial medical crises to drive demand for their expensive products. They had infiltrated regulatory agencies, bribed officials, and silenced critics. The scale of the corruption was staggering. Finally, adjudicator Mira Chen called for a formal vote on Daniel's conviction. The tribunal, now led by a new senior adjudicator named Tivax, reviewed all the evidence. The vote was unanimous. Daniel's conviction was overturned. Chen wrote the official opinion herself. Daniel read it later that evening, alone in his quarters. Her words were precise and cutting, laying out exactly how the original trial had been compromised by corruption. She stated clearly that Daniel's actions, while technically illegal, were morally justified given the false quarantine. She called for comprehensive reforms to prevent corporate influence in judicial decisions. The opinion ended with a paragraph that Daniel read 3 times. Lieutenant Daniel Hayes committed an act of mercy in defiance of unjust authority. He saved lives at great personal cost. His subsequent survival on Carvos 9 demonstrates not only the remarkable resilience of his species, but also the strength of character that drove his original actions. This tribunal failed in its duty to provide justice. We can only hope that by correcting this failure, we take the first step toward rebuilding the trust that has been lost. Daniel felt something loosen in his chest. He had not realized how much he needed to hear those words, to have his actions officially recognized as right rather than criminal. But the fight was not over. The Pharmax Collective still existed, still had power in many sectors. They issued statements denying all wrongdoing, claiming they were victims of a campaign to discredit them. Their lawyers filed motions and appeals, trying to delay or dismiss the investigations. Admiral Cross was not interested in their delays. She worked with other military leaders to push for immediate action. The Galactic Council, facing massive public pressure and media scrutiny, finally agreed to act. Sanctions were imposed on Pharmax. Their assets were frozen. Their business licenses were suspended pending investigation. The company was effectively broken apart, its various divisions sold off or absorbed by other organizations. The executives responsible for the corruption faced criminal charges. The quarantine on Colony Refuge 12 was lifted immediately. Relief ships were sent with proper medical supplies and personnel. The colonists, who had been isolated for so long, were finally able to receive help and reconnect with the broader galaxy. Daniel received a message from the colony's leaders. They wanted him to visit. They wanted to thank him in person, to show him what his sacrifice had accomplished. Daniel agreed, but he asked for time. He was not ready yet to face those families, to see the children he had saved and accept their gratitude, because Daniel knew the truth. He had not saved them out of heroism or nobility. He had saved them because it was the right thing to do, because standing by while children died was unacceptable. He had simply done what any decent person would do if they had the means. The fact that such a basic act of decency had led to such massive consequences said more about the corrupt system than it did about Daniel's character. One evening, Daniel stood at the window of his quarters and looked out at the stars. Admiral Cross joined him, carrying 2 glasses of water. "You seem troubled," she said, offering him a glass. Daniel accepted it. "I keep thinking about all the other cases Velthon presided over. How many people did he condemn unjustly? How many are still suffering because of his corruption?" "The review board is looking into every case from the past 10 years, Cross said. "It will take time, but justice will be served." "Will it?" Daniel asked. "Velthon resigned. He will live comfortably in exile somewhere. Torin will probably serve a few years in a minimum security facility and then be released. The Pharmax executives will have expensive lawyers who will drag out their trials for years. Where is the justice in that?" Cross sighed. "The system is imperfect, but it is better than it was before you exposed the corruption. That matters." "Does it?" Daniel looked at her. "I survived Carvos 9, and that survival changed things. But what about all the others who did not survive? What about all the people who were sent there before me, who died alone and forgotten? They deserve justice, too." "You are right," Cross admitted. "They do. And perhaps that is why your next actions are so important." "What do you mean?" 3 months after Daniel's conviction was overturned, the Galactic Council passed the Hayes Resolution. The new law abolished the practice of exiling criminals to death worlds. It established independent oversight committees to review judicial decisions for corruption. It created protections for whistleblowers who exposed corporate wrongdoing. And it mandated that all quarantine decisions be reviewed by multiple independent medical authorities. Daniel stood in the council chamber as the resolution was announced. Representatives from dozens of worlds voted in favor. Even species that had initially opposed the reforms ultimately supported them, unable to justify their previous positions in the face of public pressure. When the vote was complete, the council's speaker, an elderly Krillian named Vextar, addressed Daniel directly. "Lieutenant Hayes, your actions and your survival have forced this body to confront uncomfortable truths about our institutions. While we cannot undo the injustice you suffered, we can ensure that future generations will not face the same failures of justice. This resolution is named in your honor as recognition of your courage and your sacrifice." Daniel nodded but said nothing. Words felt inadequate. The resolution was a victory, but it could not bring back those who had died on Carvos 9 before him. It could not erase the months he spent fighting for survival on that hell world. But it was something. It was progress. After the ceremony, Daniel met with the leaders of Colony Refuge 12. They had traveled to Meridian 7 specifically to see him. There were 12 of them, parents and community organizers, and they carried letters from every family in the colony. "We wanted to thank you in person," said Gregory Hunt, the colony's elected mayor. His voice shook with emotion. "You saved our children when no one else would help. You gave up everything to bring them medicine." Daniel felt uncomfortable with their gratitude. "I only did what was right." "That is exactly why we are thankful," said another parent, a woman named Claire Brooks. "You knew it was right, and you did it anyway, even knowing the cost. Most people would have looked away. You did not." They gave him the letters, hundreds of them, written by the children and their families. Daniel promised to read every one. Later that night, alone in his quarters, he did exactly that. He read stories from children who were now healthy, going to school, playing with friends. He read thank you notes from parents who had watched their children suffer and thought they would die. One letter stood out. It was from a girl named Amy Foster, who had been 7 years old when Daniel delivered the medicine. Now she was 8, and her handwriting was careful and precise. "Dear Mr. Hayes, my mom says you are a hero. I think she is right. When I was sick, I was scared. I thought I was going to die. But then you came with the medicine and I got better. Now I want to be a pilot like you, so I can help people too. Thank you for saving me. Love, Amy." Daniel put the letter down and closed his eyes. This was why he had done it. This was why the months on Carvos 9, the pain and fear and loneliness, had been worth it. Amy and the other 46 children were alive. They had futures now. Opportunities to grow and learn and become whoever they wanted to be. The next week, Daniel traveled to Colony Refuge 12. Captain Morgan piloted him there on the Wandering Star, along with Admiral Cross and a medical team that would conduct follow-up examinations of the colonists. The welcome Daniel received was overwhelming. The entire colony turned out to greet him. They had created a memorial garden with 47 trees, one for each child he saved. Young trees now, but they would grow tall and strong, lasting long after Daniel was gone. The children were there too, all of them healthy and energetic. They crowded around Daniel, asking questions about space travel and Carvos 9 and what it was like to be a hero. Daniel tried to answer them, but his throat kept tightening with emotion. Amy Foster pushed her way to the front. She looked up at Daniel with wide eyes and said, "I made this for you." She handed him a drawing of a spaceship with Daniel Hayes' hero written across the top in crayon. Daniel knelt down to her level. "Thank you, Amy. I will keep this forever." "Are you going to keep flying ships?" she asked. "Yes," Daniel said. "I am going to keep helping people." "Good," Amy said seriously, "because we need people like you." Daniel spent 3 days on the colony. He met with families, toured the rebuilt medical facilities, and saw how the community had recovered from their ordeal. He also met with scientists who were studying the Festin fever outbreak, using the information from the Carvos 9 data crystals to develop better treatments. Before he left, the colony held a dedication ceremony. They officially named their school the Daniel Hayes Learning Center. Daniel protested, saying he did not deserve such an honor, but the colonists insisted. "You gave us hope when we had none," Gregory Hunt said during the ceremony. "You proved that one person doing the right thing can change the world. Our children will learn that lesson every day when they walk into this building." When Daniel returned to Meridian 7, he found that his life had changed in ways he had not anticipated. He was famous now, recognized everywhere he went. News outlets wanted interviews. Publishers wanted him to write a book. Politicians wanted his endorsement. Daniel turned down most of the requests. He did not want fame or attention. But Admiral Cross convinced him to do a few carefully selected interviews with journalists who would tell his story accurately. One interview in particular reached billions of viewers across the galaxy. The journalist, a Quellan named Nixiva, asked Daniel about his time on Carvos 9. "What kept you going?" Nixiva asked. "What made you fight to survive when you knew the Tribunal expected you to die?" Daniel thought about his answer carefully. "I refused to give them that satisfaction. They wanted to kill me for saving children. They wanted to erase me quietly, to make me disappear. Every day I survived was proof that they were wrong. Every day was a victory against the corruption that sent me there." "Do you have any regrets?" "Only one," Daniel said. "I regret that I could not do more. I saved 47 children. But there were other colonies suffering too, other people who needed help. I wish I could have done more." "You did everything you could," Nixiva said gently. "You risked your life, you endured hell, and you exposed massive corruption. What more could anyone ask?" Daniel did not answer, because he knew the truth. There was always more that could be done, more people who needed help, more injustice to fight against. Admiral Cross offered Daniel a position in Galactic Military Intelligence, working to identify and combat corruption in interstellar commerce. It was important work, and Daniel respected it, but he turned down the offer. "That is not who I am," Daniel explained. "I am a pilot. I help people by delivering what they need, going places others will not go. That is how I can make a difference." Instead, Daniel accepted a position as captain of a new ship called the Refuge Star. The ship was funded by donations from grateful colonists and human advocacy groups. Its mission was to deliver medical supplies and humanitarian aid to underserved colonies throughout the galaxy. Daniel assembled a crew of people who shared his values. Captain Morgan asked to join as his executive officer, wanting to be part of something meaningful. Dr. Ben Parker signed on as chief medical officer. Kate Sullivan became security chief. Others joined too, people who had been inspired by Daniel's story and wanted to help. The Refuge Star's first mission was to deliver medical supplies to 3 remote colonies that had been ignored by the major pharmaceutical companies. The supplies were provided free of charge by organizations that had formed in the wake of the Pharmax scandal. Daniel stood on the bridge of his new ship, watching the stars pass by, and felt something he had not felt in a long time. Peace. Purpose. This was what he was meant to do. Over the next 2 years, the Refuge Star visited dozens of colonies. They delivered medicine, food, educational materials, and technical assistance. They helped communities recover from disasters and build infrastructure. Daniel became known not as the man who survived Carvos 9, but as someone who used that survival to help others. Daniel also worked with the Galactic Survey Service to develop new survival training programs. His experience on Carvos 9 became the basis for advanced endurance training for pilots and explorers. He created detailed guides on adaptation techniques, mental resilience, and survival in extreme environments. The training program was so effective that other species requested access to the materials. Daniel agreed, believing that survival knowledge should be shared freely. The program saved countless lives over the following years, helping people survive emergencies and hostile environments across the galaxy. On the second anniversary of his return from Carvos 9, Daniel visited Colony Refuge 12 again. The trees in the memorial garden had grown taller. The children were older, some now entering their teenage years. The colony had prospered, becoming a model for sustainable development and community resilience. Amy Foster was 10 years old now. She greeted Daniel with a huge smile and announced that she had been accepted into a junior pilot training program. Daniel congratulated her, feeling proud of how far she had come. That evening, Daniel walked through the memorial garden alone. He touched each of the 47 trees, remembering the faces of the children they represented. He thought about the choice he had made, the price he had paid, and the lives that continued because of it. He had survived Carvos 9. He had exposed corruption. He had changed laws and saved more lives. But the most important thing, Daniel realized, was not the grand achievements. It was the simple fact that these 47 children were alive and thriving, making their own marks on the galaxy. One of those children, Amy, would become a pilot. Another wanted to be a doctor. Another was studying engineering. They would go on to do amazing things, and some of those things would help other people, creating ripples of positive change that would spread far beyond what Daniel could see. His sacrifice had been worth it. Every moment of suffering on Carvos 9, every day of fear and pain and loneliness had been worth it to give these children their futures. As Daniel stood in the garden, the sun setting behind him, he heard footsteps. He turned to see the 47 children approaching, now ranging from age 5 to 18. They had organized this without telling him, wanting to express their gratitude together. Amy stepped forward as their spokesperson. "Mr. Hayes, we wanted to tell you something. All of us have decided to dedicate our lives to helping others, just like you helped us. We are going to be doctors and pilots and teachers and engineers. We are going to make the galaxy better, and we will tell everyone we help about the man who saved us when we were children." The other children nodded, some with tears in their eyes. Daniel felt his own eyes getting wet. "You do not need to do that," Daniel said, his voice rough. "Live your lives however you want. Be happy. That is enough." "We want to," Amy insisted. "You showed us that one person can make a difference. We want to be that kind of person, too." Daniel looked at these children, no longer sick and dying, but strong and full of hope. He saw their determination, their compassion, their desire to make the world better, and he realized that his legacy was not his survival or his fame or his achievements. His legacy was standing right in front of him. 47 lives that would touch thousands of others, creating change that would echo through generations. "Then go out there and do it," Daniel said, smiling through his tears. "Make me proud." The children surrounded him, and for a moment, Daniel let himself feel the full weight of what he had accomplished. Not just the survival, not just the justice, but this, a garden of trees and a generation of young people committed to making the galaxy better. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. "You have become a symbol," Cross said. "Humans across the galaxy look at you and see what our species is capable of. Other species are reassessing their assumptions about human resilience. You have political capital now, influence that you can use." "I do not want to be a politician," Daniel said. "I am not suggesting you become one," Cross replied. "But you can use your voice to push for real change. You can speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. You can make sure that what happened to you never happens to anyone else." Daniel considered her words. He thought about the children he saved, about the colonists on Refuge 12, about all the victims of Pharmax's greed. He thought about the others like him who had been sentenced to Carvos 9 and died there. Maybe Cross was right. Maybe surviving was not enough. Maybe he had a responsibility to use his survival for something greater. "What did you have in mind?" Daniel asked. "Proceed until these matters are resolved." Other adjudicators began voicing their agreement. The chamber descended into arguments and debates. Velthan tried to maintain order, but his authority was crumbling. Daniel watched it all with calm satisfaction. He had survived Carvos 9. Now he was watching the corrupt system that sent him there begin to collapse. As the session finally ended in chaos, Admiral Cross placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Well done, Lieutenant," she said quietly. "But this is not over. They will try to find ways to discredit you, to bury this evidence." "Let them try," Daniel replied. "I survived 6 months on the most dangerous planet in the galaxy. Whatever they throw at me now will seem easy by comparison." That night, Daniel was given quarters on the station under Admiral Cross's protection. He stood at the window, looking out at the stars, and thought about the children he had saved. Somewhere out there, Colony Refuge 12 was still under quarantine. Those families were still suffering, but not for much longer. Daniel had survived to tell his story. Now he would make sure justice was served, ing that made his heart race. A ship, a real ship, not a transport pod, but an actual vessel entering the planet's atmosphere. Someone had detected his beacon. Someone was coming. Daniel grabbed the data crystals and his documentation. He made sure his appearance was not too threatening. Then he waited at the cave entrance, watching as the ship landed on the flat area near the old pod remains. The door opened and 3 figures emerged in protective suits. One of them, a woman with captain's insignia on her suit, approached carefully. "Lieutenant Daniel Hayes?" she called out, her voice transmitted through speakers. "That's me," Daniel replied. His voice was rough from months of disuse. The captain stopped and stared at him. Even through her helmet, Daniel could see the shock on her face. "How?" she whispered. "How are you alive?" S would continue. "They would grow up, have families, make their own choices. His sacrifice would mean something." Daniel opened his eyes and looked out the window at the stars passing by. Somewhere out there was the planet that was supposed to kill him. He had 3 days to prepare himself for whatever waited there. He had faced death before. He had flown through combat zones and survived crashes that should have killed him. He had endured interrogation and torture during his time in the military. But this was different. This time, he was not fighting an enemy he could see. He was fighting an entire planet designed to kill anything that landed on it. But Daniel Hayes was a survivor. And if there was even the smallest chance to live through this, he would find it. Not because he feared death, but because giving up would mean letting them win. The ship flew on through the darkness, carrying Daniel toward his fate.